Hi everyone. So I'll be talking about the link between traumatic brain injury and Parkinson's disease, particularly what factors we think can forecast risk. And I thought that I'd start by telling you a little bit about Parkinson's. So it's currently the second most common neurodegenerative disease following Alzheimer's disease. There's about 8 to 10 million cases worldwide, and 1 million of those occur in the United States alone. Here in Australia, it's also a significant problem. Recent data suggests that there's about 110,000 Australians currently living with Parkinson's disease, so meaning that it affects about 1 in every 275 Australians. And there's actually 37 new cases diagnosed each day. Now, that's particularly concerning because, as I'll speak about in a moment, age is the greatest risk factor that underlies Parkinson's disease, and we live in a rapidly aging world. So we know that Parkinson's affects roughly 1% of the population over the age of 60, but when you look in individuals over the age of 85, the number affected actually rises to 4%. And it's going to get worse. As I mentioned a moment ago, our population is rapidly aging, and while it's great that we're living longer, we also need to focus on living healthier for longer, and we're currently not doing that successfully. As you can see in this graph, between now and 2040, the number of cases will significantly rise. In fact, by 2030, the prevalence of the disease is expected to double. And it's a disease that has an enormous economic cost to it. So the total economic cost of Parkinson's disease in the United States alone is $14.5 billion annually. And if costs continue to rise, they'll double by the year 2040. You can see here where Parkinson's disease sits in relation to other neurological diseases. It really has a quite significant cost component to it. But that's not really at the heart of why any of us do this research. Less than the money, we're concerned about the people whose lives it impacts. And there's also an enormous human impact. There's over 17,000 years of life lost annually due to premature death associated with Parkinson's disease. And that's just heart-rending as a statistic. So within the brain, Parkinson's disease is characterized by a loss of brain cells that sit right in the middle of your brain in a structure called the substantia nigra. So in an individual without Parkinson's disease, you would expect to see these really well-defined dark bands. And they look dark because these are cells that produce a brain chemical called dopamine. What you can see here is that in people with Parkinson's disease, those dark bands have disappeared because the brain cells that produce dopamine have died away. But by the time someone actually goes to their GP and receives a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, they've already lost about 60 to 80% of that chemical dopamine. And that's really catastrophic and really limits how beneficial treatment options might be. So we need to become better at understanding who's going to develop Parkinson's disease. And in order to do that, we have to know what factors predict risk of Parkinson's disease. Well, what makes Parkinson's disease particularly interesting is the fact that if you look at time of diagnosis here, which is indicated by this dotted line, in the decades prior to it, there are a number of non-motor symptoms that we can detect. These range from things like constipation, depression, sexual dysfunction, all the way to changes in smell, and a particular type of sleep disorder known as REM sleep behavior disorder. So the idea is that if we track outcomes after a known environmental risk factor, that could potentially help us to identify the factors that are predictive of who does go on to develop Parkinson's disease. And there are a number of potential environmental risk factors. So pesticide exposure is one. As some of you may have seen on the ABC today, COVID-19 is also being flagged as a potential risk factor. But one of the ones that's most consistently been identified across studies is traumatic brain injury. 32% of people who have Parkinson's disease have a history of mild traumatic brain injury or concussion that's associated with a loss of consciousness, even when there's a 37-year gap between when they have the concussion and when they're diagnosed with PD. And in a prospective study, meaning a study that looked forward in time in veterans, mild traumatic brain injury was found to increase the risk of developing Parkinson's by 56%, and more severe injuries actually increase your risk by 83%, as you can see in this graph here. So our team is interested in tracking outcomes following traumatic brain injury using a multifactorial approach. And we were really fortunate to receive almost $2 million in funding from the MRFF TBI mission in order to do this. So what are we actually going to do? Well, over the next 3 years, we will investigate 800 participants who have Parkinson's disease, 100 with Parkinson's rather, 100 controls, and 200 each of people who are within a year of experiencing a TBI, which is really a period of acute recovery, within the first decade after injury, and then more than 1 decade post-injury. This will allow us to actually track change over time in a cross-sectional way at this stage. And it's a highly hypothesis-driven approach. So we believe that traumatic brain injury leads to chronic and sustained inflammation within the brain in key brain regions, and that this leads to death of vulnerable brainstem neuron populations in regions like the substantia nigra that I showed you a little while ago, where those dopamine neurons start to die. And we think that that starts to lead to the emergence of those prodromal non-motor symptoms, and then eventually conversion to Parkinson's disease itself. So we have a way that we're going to look at each of the different steps of that hypothesis, ranging from genetics and biomarkers to investigate individual differences in neuroinflammation, to what's happening to those brainstem neurons using really novel MRI imaging and PET imaging, and then all the way up to looking at both prodromal symptoms and cognitive and motor measures in our participants. And so what will we do then? Well, we hope to take all of those different measures and use machine learning techniques to identify an algorithm that predicts prognosis after TBI. And this is really critical because currently we don't really know what someone's long-term outcomes will be after they experience a traumatic brain injury. We do know that about a quarter of people actually get worse between follow-ups at 7 and 14 years, even though it's been many years since they initially experienced the injury. So we hope that by shedding light on the pathological processes that occur in the brain following TBI, we may be able to predict risk of PD. And this is significant because if we know who's at risk, we may be able to do something to stop it. We hope that this will allow for earlier and more targeted treatment approaches. And really, remember, the future of medicine is personal, so that's where Find TBI is heading.
Of course, none of this happens in an independent way.
So I'd like to thank the Find TBI team, both here in Australia, where we have many collaborators, as well as in the UK and US. My lab group, which is the Candle Lab at Adelaide and the Translational Neuropathology Lab at Adelaide, who we're affiliated with, but most importantly, the funding bodies. So the MRFF, James and Diana Ramsey Foundation, who provided critical seed funding into this, ARC, who's funding a parallel study in healthy older adults, but most importantly, of course, the NRF. And on a personal note, the NRF gave me my first ever independent research grant when I started my lab. So I really, can never thank them enough for bringing us where we are today. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Lyndsey. And next